Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Scott McCandless. It is Monday, February 5th, and this is your Monday briefing. For those of you watching the House-passed tax package, restoring key business tax provisions, the focus now shifts to the Senate, where Republicans in that chamber are still potentially seeking amendments before a vote. Joining us to discuss what Senate action we may see on the tax package and what companies need to do to prepare for the 2025 negotiations on the expiring TCJA tax provisions are Todd Metcalf and Karl Russo. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So Todd, let's start with you and focus on the Senate a little bit. What might we expect from the Senate, and maybe more importantly, when?
So the Senate is in session this week. They're going to, but they're not going to consider the tax bill, or if they do, let's say it will be a big surprise. Their focus this week is on the security supplementals of Ukraine funding, Israel funding, the border deal that's just been announced. And then they'll be going on a 2-week recess for the President's Day holiday. When they return, I believe it's that 26th of February, that week, that's when the focus will presumably shift, but it will not necessarily shift to tax. It will shift to appropriations because that first CR deadline is March 1st at the end of that week. So I think the question really becomes in twofold in the Senate. One, will the sort of Republican opposition that's been sort of percolating out there and the need for amendments, et cetera, will that have been overcome, or will it have solidified between now and the end of the recess? That's question number one, because if you can't get 60, it's sort of irrelevant. And then the next question is, will that legislation not go on its own as it did in the House, or will it rather ride on one of those appropriations bills, either March 1st or March 8th appropriations bills? At the moment, I think at least Senator Schumer's office seems to be indicating that it's probably more likely to ride something, whether that's one of those CRs or the FAA bill, which also FAA authority also expires March 8th. So I think we're looking late February, early March is timing, and we just sort of have to see, can you overcome the reluctance at the moment of some Senate Republicans to get over the finish line?
Sure, that makes sense. So let's hope this does get over the finish line. But if it does, it sounds like we'll be just coming out of the end of Q1 when it does. What might we expect for the rest of the year from Congress in terms of tax issues?
I think that what we're going to be looking at for the rest of the year is not making law. We're not going to see the House and Senate come together again. At least that's not likely. So we're not going to see a lot of things go to the president's desk and signing ceremonies or anything of the sort. I think that what we're going to see in both chambers, probably with different approaches and different directions, is the beginnings of preparations for 2025. We're going to see a lot of briefing of staff and members on what is set to expire at the end of 2025, and what are the options to address those expirations and changes in law that are coming up. I think we're going to have hearings on what's working, what isn't working. Chairman Smith of the Ways and Means Committee has publicly said that's exactly what he plans to do, is have public hearings about is TCJA working? What parts of it are working? What parts may not be working? Are there other parts of the tax code that need to be addressed? So I think the rest of this year is really going to be focused on sort of preparing for that massive transaction in 2025. So that's really, I think, what we can expect for the balance of the year.
That makes sense. Karl, let's bring you in. And thinking about 2025, what kinds of things should companies be looking for as we get into some of these hearings and maybe briefing papers that might come out this year? And what should companies be thinking about doing as they get into 2025?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's really important for companies to do is to model what the changes that are scheduled to happen in 2025 mean for their companies, and then to make that known to members of Congress and the tax writing staff on the Hill so that they know how important some of these provisions are going to be to them. So if you think about whether that's the increase in rates that are scheduled for the FDII and for the BEAT and some of those GILTI provisions for multinational companies, but also what it's going to mean if the deal that we have now in terms of foreign R&D being left at 15-year amortization, what does that mean for the companies, as well as there might be a second shot to try to make that full expensing in 2025. But the other thing to keep in mind is 2025 is not only just important for the TCJA related provisions, but we also have Pillar 2 coming online in that year. And potentially the UTPRs, the undertaxed profits rules in all these other countries, which could affect domestic U.S. tax incentives. And so companies really need to be modeling what the effects of that rule in the OECD exercise means for them, and bringing that information to Congress as Congress contemplates maybe what to do to modify or address some of those domestic provisions as part of the big transaction that Todd said is going to be taking place in that year.
Makes sense. And one of the things that we saw happen with the tax bill currently under consideration was a very large bipartisan vote, both at the Ways and Means Committee and the House. We'll see where it goes in the Senate. But do we expect something similar in 2025 in terms of support for the TCJA, or how might the politics of it play out, particularly on the revenue side?
Yeah, so 2025 is going to be a much larger consideration. You're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of $4.5 trillion. If you address just the expiring provisions, they're about $3+ on the individual side and another $1 trillion on the domestic business provisions. So one of the things that's going to be really different is there aren't $4.5 trillion of easy pay-fors lying around. You know, the current Congress felt like they needed to offset all of the provisions, virtually all of the provisions in the current extenders deal. I think that's unlikely to persist when we get to 2025. Democrats have talked about wanting to pay for some of the provisions, maybe for high-income individuals. But if 80% of the cost is going to be extending the individual provisions for those making under $400,000, it's not going to be $2.5 or $3 trillion of easy pay-fors lying around to do that. So I think it's going to depend on what the debt and deficit situation looks like and what the appetite is. On a bipartisan basis, I think you could hold hands and maybe do it with a particular budget constraint, but we're going to have to see what the constellation of characters looks like when we get there.
Sure, makes sense. Thanks for the look ahead to 2025. So Todd, maybe a last question for you. The House might be taking up a separate tax bill related to the state and local tax deduction. Could you talk a little bit about it and where it might be going?
They've introduced legislation in the House, and it's been reported out for floor consideration. We don't have it scheduled yet, but it's been promised to be scheduled, so we'll see what happens this week. It would increase to $20,000 the deductibility of state and local tax deductions for couples filing jointly with incomes under $500,000. My guess is I find it hard to imagine that it actually succeeds in the House. We know that there's sort of historic resistance among, sort of rank and file Republicans to expanding the SALT cap deduction and a SALT cap. And so you've got probably relatively few in the Republican conference that are going to vote for it. You might think that Democrats would sort of more naturally vote for it because the higher tax states are more represented by Democrats. But at the end of the day, what we know and what the distribution table will show, et cetera, is that it greatly skews as a tax cut for very high income individuals. Even if you sort of cap it at $500,000, where that ultimately ends up is going to be in very wealthy individuals. And my guess is you'll split the Democratic conference. And so do you get 218? I'm really sure it dubious, but they get their vote. So we'll see.
Sure. Great. Well, Todd, Karl, thank you so much for your insights and for being here today. Appreciate it very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And for our viewers, you'll find a link to the latest Week in Review with Pam Olson, as well as a conversation with Craig Stromberg about the risk outlook. And stay tuned for another Week in Review coming up this Friday. We appreciate you joining us. Take care.